Welcome back to World Religions. This video series is intended to accompany the textbook A Short Introduction to World Religions, edited by Christopher Partridge and published by Fortress Press. It would also work well with any other semester-long survey of world religions course. Chapter 5, Ritual and Performance. Ritual in general can be defined as patterned, formal, symbolic action, where there's a set pattern or prototype for the actions, for the behaviors of the ritual participants, and these actions have a deeper meaning or purpose. An example of a non-religious ritual is singing the national anthem. The purpose of singing the national anthem could be to express commitment towards or approval of a nation or political community. Religious rituals are going to be like rituals in general, but they will reference sacred or supernatural beings, such as God, spirits, or ancestors, whom the participants invoke, propitiate, or feed through offerings or sacrifices, or they at least communicate with in some fashion. So the Christian Mass is just one example of a religious ritual. A bit more about religious rituals. They often attempt to enact or deal with what you could call the central dilemmas, concerns, or issues of human existence, like continuity and stability, growth and fertility, death, mortality, immortality, and transcendence. Another example of a religious ritual is the Upanayana initiation ceremony in Hinduism. So this is available for the men of the twice born, the Dvija Varnas or castes, which include Brahmins or priests, Kshatriyas or nobles, and Vaishyas or merchants. So a young man or boy from one of these castes, when he reaches the appropriate age, will study the Veda, the Hindu scripture, and Brahmins or priests will help conduct this ceremony. Like many other Vedic rituals, this takes place in front of a sacred fire, into which offerings to the gods can be placed. Religious rituals can transform people and situations. Most obviously, initiation rituals or other rituals that change the social status of a person. So if you look at traditional coming of age rituals for men, they characteristically, or we might say stereotypically, are often aimed at making a young, immature boy into a fierce warrior. Whereas traditional initiation ceremonies for women are often designed to transform them into wives and mothers. The textbook talks briefly about the mind-body interactions, you could say, that are often involved with ritual. Ritual are physical actions, but they have psychological effects. And so there's something super rational about this process. The mind is changed, but not through a process of reasoning typically. It's the physical action, the participation, group dynamics that can cause the transformation. Another aspect of this is initiations or other rituals that are performed in frightening or otherwise stressful circumstances. That can do a lot of different things, can just take people out of their normal way of thinking and feeling. It can also cement or engrave the memory of that ritual experience on the mind of the person. And of course, rituals often involve the use of symbols and sacred objects. Messages about the individual, society, or the cosmos can be communicated through the manipulation of symbols and sacred objects, like the role of the fire in the Upanayana ceremony, or in the Christian Eucharist, the role of the host, the body and the blood of Jesus. Rituals can also be used to control, inspire, subvert, stabilize, and so on, individuals and groups. In other words, they're usually intended to change something about an individual or a group of people, to bring about a new state of affairs. So they are actions that have a practical purpose for the most part. Catherine Bell has a very helpful classification scheme of types of rituals. Number one, rites of passage or life crisis rituals. These are things like birth ceremonies, naming ceremonies, coming of age ceremonies, and so on. They mark off a new stage of a person's life. Some examples from Christianity could be baptism and confirmation, both of which are initiations into the religious community of a church. Number two, calendrical rituals and commemorative rites. So these would be ones that are held at particular times of the year. So the feast days of saints, for example, in Catholic and Orthodox Christianity, or the Feast of the Assumption in Catholicism specifically. Number three, rites of exchange or communication. So these often involve offerings given to a god or spirit in exchange for some benefit, some blessing, or some information. Now, one example of this in Christianity, the main one, is the Eucharist or Holy Communion itself. This is a kind of iteration of a rite of exchange in that the offering given to God is the body and blood of God Himself. So there's deeper, different layers of meaning there. But you see in most religions some kind of ceremony of offering to God or some other sacred or supernatural being. Number four, rites of affliction. So these rituals would be performed if a person is sick or cursed or otherwise afflicted with some negative condition. An example from Catholic Christianity is the rite of extreme unction or anointing of the sick, which is a sacrament, typically done if someone is ill, elderly, close to death. The purpose of this sacrament can be healing, but it can also just be to prepare the person for death or the transition. Another example of this is exorcism. And this happens both within the Catholic Church, but also many other religions, including animistic religions, where demons or other evil or harmful spirits could be expelled from the person who's being afflicted. Um, and views about this vary, but a lot of times in religions, at least traditionally or historically, illness would often be connected with spiritual affliction of some kind. So you often see the belief that if someone is ill, it's because a demon or some spirit or some god has been offended or has targeted the person. And so this type of ritual can be used to counteract that sort of negative or harmful spiritual influence. Number five, rites of feasting, fasting, or festivals. So these would involve large feasts or meals, typically communal, or of renouncing food, as in fasting. So examples from Christianity are the feasts of Christmas and Easter, both of which often have communal meals, and the season or festival of Lent, where there's typically fasting and other types of additional renunciation or sacrifice practiced by believers. Number six, political rituals. There's often a religious component to ceremonies that confer legitimacy upon political rulers, such as the coronation of kings. Scholars' views of ritual vary. Mircea Eliade, who famously did a lot of work on the concept of the sacred, he wrote the book The Sacred and the Profane, he focused on the explanatory value of rituals. So, in other words, how they relate to myths that explain the cosmos or the place of humanity in the cosmos. Rituals can be regarded as reenactments, according to Eliade, of primal cosmogonic myths. That means myths about the origins of the universe or of humanity. And through performing these rituals, the culture brings the past continually back into the present. Robin Horton emphasized the reality of the religious beliefs behind ritual actions. And this is largely derived from his field work among the Kalabari of Nigeria. In other words, religious rituals don't just relate to stories or myths that may have some kind of symbolic uh, meaning or significance, but they actually express beliefs that have meaning and coherence to their adherents. In other words, it's not just a story. The rituals have their power precisely because they are believed in, they are taken literally, often by the participants. And going back to Emil Durkheim in the 1800s, as well as with later generations of scholars, they would often emphasize that rituals are effective precisely because they make statements about social phenomena, such as Durkheim's view that religious rituals can kind of bind, illustrate, or create social identity. Maurice Bloch, more recently, argues that rituals are not only statements, nor are they only actions. They kind of combine statements or meanings with behaviors. Their message can be simultaneously communicated and disguised. What he means by that is the fact that there's a behavioral component to the ritual. That behavior can simultaneously reveal aspects of the meaning of the ritual, but because it's going to be symbolic or indirect, it can also serve to partially obscure the meaning. So there's a kind of double-sided or dual valenced quality to the way meaning is conveyed in rituals. We could also talk about how the role of symbols in rituals can change over time, their interpretation can change. Victor Turner, when he did his field work among the Ndembu peoples of Africa, he looked at various ceremonies like healing ceremonies, the installation of chiefs, initiation rituals, and his work kind of emphasized the fact that the symbols used in the rituals still had their apparent original meaning. They still had the full emotional and social force. In contrast, Fritz Stahl, who was a scholar of the Vedic rituals from Hinduism, he claimed that at least the meaning of some of those symbols had been forgotten. Now, I have not actually read Stahl's original research, so I'm not 100% sure what he was referring to here, but I think he was probably referring to the fact that some of the Vedic rituals were reinterpreted by later generations and traditions within Hinduism. Just a famous example is the horse sacrifice that would be performed by ancient Indian kings as a way of solidifying and divinely sanctioning their rule. This in the later period of the Upanishads from around 500 BC and after came to be interpreted more symbolically because this was the main sacrifice. The horse was an animal that signified the power, the strength, and rule of the king, who ideally would be the ruler of the whole world or the whole human world. These later sages and wise people who wrote the Upanishads, their view of the sacrifice is of a yogi or a renunciate, a shramana. They're renouncing their attachments to the world. That's just one example of how the earlier Vedic rituals, which may have a more literal or worldly significance, get interpreted as part of the supreme spiritual goal of Hinduism, which is moksha or liberation. There are other examples too of just kind of drift or reinterpretation of ancient Vedic rituals. Some not just involving reinterpretation of symbols, but another example of this is other types of animal sacrifice that used to be a part of Vedic ceremonies. They're still in Veda. I mean, they're in the Veda that's recited and used by modern Hindus, but most modern Hindus no longer practice animal sacrifice. And indeed, many of them would look upon that as a kind of impure or sacrilegious practice, which might offend Krishna, for example, or Vishnu. So that's just a couple of examples of transformations in the Veda over time. And it's not unique to the Veda or Hinduism by any means. Over the generations, over the centuries, you often see meanings of symbols in religions either get reinvented, reinterpreted, expanded on, added to, or sometimes just forgotten and changed. So it's not always a literal forgetting, but sometimes it is. Other times it's more of a gradual process of evolution or development. Arnold von Gennep identified a threefold pattern in rituals. separation from the community, transition, often involving some sort of trial, and then reintegration into the community, but with a new social status. So, for example, male initiation rituals often follow this pattern or format. You can also see it, though, in seasonal festivals where they often involve people taking a step outside, separating from their normal daily activities before the end of the festival, reintegrating back into their normal life. Victor Turner was an English scholar who talked about liminality or the liminal stage, which often takes place in life cycle rituals, rites of passage like male initiations into adulthood. There's a movement from the usual social structure to a position outside or opposed to the structure, and that involves crossing some liminal middle threshold stage, marking the boundary between those two. As part of the liminal stage, people going through an initiation, initians, often face a leveling process where they're kind of stripped down. Their individuality is erased. For example, a young man's hair might be shaved off, or it could be grown long. Either way, they're taken out of their usual appearance, their usual place in society. Neophytes are those who have not yet been initiated, and they're often isolated from the everyday world before they undertake their initiation, and they may undergo ordeals or trials. In addition to providing a kind of memorable marker from the before time to their now taking a place as an adult in society, for example, the shared trauma, the shared trial of these initiations can bind the initiants together. And historically, this also may have served to bind together males of a similar age from within the same culture, many of whom would have later perhaps been fighting alongside each other to protect their tribe or their clan or what have you. Turner also talked about communitas, which is just a Latin word meaning community or togetherness. So he used it to refer to this idea of a spontaneous, immediate, but concrete relatedness that's typical of people in the liminal stage of a rite of passage. By being taken outside of their usual life, by being subjected to ordeals, they often do have that spontaneous sense of bonding. And Turner points out that this liminality or going through this liminal stage can be institutionalized, i.e., made semi permanent and extended potentially indefinitely, as happens in military and monastic communities, also in hospitals and asylums, where people, if they're there for a long time, they're kind of outside of society in this liminal space. And you can see especially how the military uses similar types of social dynamics, social processes to initiate recruits into their new identity as a soldier. And that will involve things like being able to take orders, sacrifice for their fellow soldiers, etc., etc. Another aspect of these ceremonies of initiation that involve the liminal is transmission of esoteric, secret, or hidden knowledge. And you can see this in ancient or just traditional male initiation ceremonies. Oftentimes, the ancient Greeks and Romans had mystery religions, typically involving worshiping either foreign gods or gods from their own culture that were being worshipped in a special way, connected to some secret knowledge or some secret ritual, usually both. And only people who had gone through the full initiation, which would often involve ordeals of various kinds, just fasting, they'd be given some secret. And it would be kept secret. It wouldn't be written down, for instance, which is why today we have very little knowledge of what some of these secrets were. Another example that's known from archaeology There are some sites connected to early or Proto-Indo-European peoples from the steppe, the Pontic Caspian steppe, involving apparently ritual sacrifice of dogs, which was not usually done by these cultures. These were nomads. They did use dogs a lot, but as helpers, as hunters, as guards, for companionship, probably all that kind of stuff. So this was a very unusual reversing of the norms of the society, killing a dog. But the common interpretation of these archaeological findings is that it was young men being forced to kill a dog in order to become adults, in order to go through this male initiation. And that would have been an ordeal, would have been a trauma, would have been something way outside the norm. But it's also speculated that with this liminal initiation rite, that they would get some sort of secret, some sort of knowledge, perhaps even something involving the dog as a totem. This is kind of getting into a whole other topic, but for many hundreds of years, probably even over 1,000, a lot of steppe peoples of Central Asia and neighboring areas like Southeastern Europe, they would often identify with a dog or a wolf as a symbol of them, especially the ruling class of noble warriors. So that's just a possible example of Turner's idea of liminal and also some kind of secret knowledge being gained as a result of this process. Bruce Lincoln was critical of von Gennep's and Turner's models of ritual and of initiation. He said that they're more relevant to male initiations than female. And that's probably true. It doesn't mean that von Gennep and Turner were wrong completely or not on to anything. It's just that their analysis was limited. It doesn't seem to cover many traditional female initiation rituals. So in the female initiation rituals, Lincoln identified a different threefold pattern of enclosure. So that's being enclosed like in a hut, for example, metamorphosis or magnification, and then emergence. He pointed out that in most traditional societies, women have less status in the social hierarchy, and that seems to play a role in the form of women's initiation rituals. The liminal stage in women's initiations is less likely to emphasize anti-structural elements. So they're not just being broken down or stripped, they're not being taken completely outside society, like into the wilderness. They might be in a hut, for example, near their village or their home itself. Women's initiation rituals also do not typically involve being brought low or stripped down as a prelude to being elevated. Instead, they may reinforce a woman's lowly place in society, or indeed, as in Lincoln's threefold pattern, that middle part is a metamorphosis, a magnification. They're growing, they're maturing into adulthood. Women's initiations are also more likely to be single or solitary rather than in a group, as in men's initiations, which often involve a group of young men of about the same age, as well as often being enclosed within a domestic space, i.e., one in or near the home or village where they ordinarily live. And women are generally adorned during these ceremonies rather than, for example, having their hair shorn off. It may be decorated. And there is usually knowledge entrusted to women as a part of these ceremonies. But according to Lincoln, it's often mundane knowledge, about how to be a wife and a mother or how to be just an adult woman generally, rather than the esoteric knowledge that's more associated with male initiation rituals. And lastly, Richard Schechner is a professor of theater who has a nice distinction between ritual on the one hand and performance on the other. It's an important distinction because these two concepts can overlap. Rituals are a type of performance, according to Schechner, but not all performances are rituals. And whether a performance counts as a ritual or theater, that is a non-ritual performance, will depend on the context. There are no absolute distinctions, and most performances, according to Schechner again, can contain elements of both. It's kind of interesting to think about that because in today's society, arguably we have less ritual and more performance. Like we're inundated with various types of media, like books, videos, video games, and so on. And many of these performances in our media can still have a kind of ritual element to them, but it's probably very subtle. So let's go into a little bit more detail about rituals on Schechner's classification. So according to Schechner, rituals are intended to be efficacious. They're supposed to accomplish something. And the audiences of rituals tend to be active in some way to participate in the aims and intentions of the ritual. So, for example, if you are at a church or a temple and there's a group ceremony, it's not just that the parishioners or the temple goers are going to be a passive audience. They may be involved in the singing or the dancing or the chanting or the other ritual actions. In rituals, time and space are sacred and they're often marked off symbolically. So, in other words, there's a more formal separation, symbolic separation from the ritual and the non ritual dimension of life. And also, that concept of the sacred is going to be there in the ritual, usually front and center. And again, connected to the idea of the rituals being intended to be efficacious or to accomplish something, the end result is what matters most in a ritual. The healing, the initiation into adulthood, aiding people when they've passed away and have moved on to the next life, and so on. And rituals are often performed for, or at least in the presence of, a god, spirit, ancestor, or some other higher power. Theatrical performance, in contrast, are mainly intended to entertain, and the audience is more of a passive observer rather than a participant. The goal of the theatrical performance is just the event itself. It's not typically done for the sake of some other objective. You might say the goal is entertainment, amusement, or some other type of dramatic end, like catharsis in the Aristotelian sense of a kind of mental or spiritual or emotional purging. But still, that catharsis or that entertainment or that other communication of ideas or feeling is connected very closely with the performance itself rather than something outside of it like healing, initiation, and so on. And so the theatrical performances are typically mainly done for the audience, those attending, and not for a god or a spirit. So that's all for chapter 5. Next up is chapter 6, Religions of Antiquity, which gives a brief survey of many ancient religions, such as ancient Egypt, ancient Greece, and so on. Until next time.